Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to give it just a few minutes before we jump in. Oh, all the way from Norway. Hi, Altar. Hi everyone. Going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes and then I'll jump right in here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in again. My name is Maggie Downing. I'm the manager of digital imaging at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. Today's webinar on file specifications for digitization is the third in a series of 6 short and focused webinars on topics related to digitization. This webinar and all of the webinars in this series are being recorded and will be available on YouTube. And a link will be sent to all registrants when it's been posted, along with a list of the resources that I've included in these slides. Like previous episodes in this series, I'll answer a few questions at the end, but if I miss your question or if you think of one later, I'll list my email address and you are all free to email me. So jumping right in, my illustrations today and these slides are all by Joris Hufnagel, who was a Flemish Renaissance manuscript illuminator. And these have all been digitized and made available by the Getty Museum. And I picked these because I like them as exacting guides for manuscript illumination and felt it suitable to today's discussion on specific digitization settings. So as promised, today we'll talk about file specifications. And these are the settings for your digitized files that you'll need to determine before you can get to work. This session will focus on still images such as books, photographs, and artwork. However, I recognize that many archives also contain audiovisual materials. So I'll include a resource at the end on audio and film motion picture materials. So first I want to introduce some of the terms that we'll discuss in today's session. In the next few slides, I'll define what I mean when we talk about file formats, resolution, color, bit depth, color space, cropping, and file naming. Then I'll discuss the various guidelines that you can look to determine which specifications are right for your materials. So file formats, simply put, these are conventions for encoding data so that a software program can render it into human readable form. Some of the most common formats for digitized archival materials are TIFF, JPEGs, and PDFs. The resolution of an image is the amount of detail that it captures. Resolution is measured in pixels per inch, abbreviated as PPI, and is often seen written as DPI or dots per inch, but these terms are interchangeable. In this example, I've highlighted how resolution affects image quality. So I've taken a detail of the same image saved at 150 ppi and 800 ppi, and zoomed into a small detail. You can see that the 150 ppi image becomes a little more pixelated and jagged, where the 800 ppi file, the image remains smooth. So color, this is pretty self-explanatory and easy to define. Do you want to scan and capture your images in color or black and white? It's a simple decision, but it has a big difference in file sizes and the file storage that you need. Bit depth is defined by the number of bits that are available to be used to represent each pixel in an image. So in the image on the left, each pixel in this image contains 1 bit, and that bit can either be black or white. But in the image on the left, each pixel contains 8 bits, so each pixel can be one of 256 shades of gray, and that results in a much smoother looking image. Color spaces or color profiles define the range and tones available for your digital files. The theory behind color spaces and color management can be a little tricky to explain quickly, and we could really dedicate a whole webinar just to color management. But the important thing to keep in mind when selecting a color space for your digitization project is that you want to select one that's widely adopted and has a decent range of colors. The idea is you want to avoid converting back and forth between color profiles, because each time you translate to a new one, you lose a little bit of complexity of the information in your image. A few common examples of color spaces or color profiles include sRGB, which has a smaller range of color and is generally used for web publication. Adobe RGB 1998, which is a medium range of colors and is almost universally accepted by different software and displays. And ProPhoto RGB has a huge range of colors and provides a lot of flexibility in editing, but it's newer and maybe less widely adopted. If you want to dive a little deeper into understanding color spaces, I recommend this short video that's linked here, and that should show up in the chat there. And this is an excerpt from a larger lesson on color management from Linda Learning. And it's just a nice, I think it's about 5 minutes long. This kind of breaks down the theory of color spaces. Cropping, this means how you'll frame your image. This decision determines how much of a border you'll show around the object, or whether you want to crop into the edges. This picture here is actually by Albrecht Dürer, since it was a good example to show how an object can be scanned to show all of the edges with a small border. And file naming is also pretty self-explanatory. This is the structure for how you choose to name your files. Your files should be named consistently and be consistently structured. And we'll discuss a little bit more about this soon. And I just have a sample here of a group of file names in a directory. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of these terms, now I want to turn to the various standards and recommendations that exist for digitization. Today I'll be focusing on file specifications that are suitable for creating digital surrogates of your materials that can then be used for many purposes. For guidance on specifications for creating digital files, there are standards and recommendations laid out by several organizations, including the American Library Association, or ALA, the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, and the Federal Agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative, or FADGI. And those links are all there in the chat. So each of these frameworks is useful in its own way. The ALA guidelines are nice because they are well illustrated, where the others are not. The NARA guidelines are helpful to consult in that they discuss workflows beyond capture, including metadata and quality control. But for today, I'll be focusing on the FADGI guidelines for digitizing cultural heritage materials. These are the most recently updated of the three and are used by some government institutions. And the information in these guidelines is a great reference point for determining file specifications. So the FADGI guidelines include different file specifications for bound volumes, documents, oversized items, newspapers, prints and photographs, photographic transparencies, paintings, and X-ray film and microfilm. The FADGI document itself can appear intimidating because it's pretty long, but the bulk of it is made up of the recommendations for each of these types of materials. So while there's more to the FADGI document, the part that's most useful for us today is the recommended performance levels for each type of material. These performance levels are laid out in quick guide tables for each type of material that outline most of the file specifications we just defined, including file formats, resolution, bit depth, color space, and color. These tables outline recommendations on a quality level scale of 1 to 4. And for creating digital surrogates, I recommend only looking to the 3 and 4 star rated recommendations. On this slide, I included an example of the performance level table for prints and photographs. And in the next few slides, I'll break down each of these specifications in the performance level section. And I see one question in the chat. Do any of these guidelines address three-dimensional objects? I haven't found in FADGI. The ones that I'm speaking to today are mostly for flat archival materials. But I'll send out a resource on three-dimensional objects. It's not as strict and not so structured in their guidelines for three-dimensional objects that I found, but I'll try to send something out that might give you some guidance there. Okay, so first and foremost, for master file formats, TIFF is usually the way to go. This uncompressed file format works well with large file sizes and can accommodate the resolution, color space, and bit depth that you often want in a master file format. Derivative files or access files can be made in pretty much any format, and these are usually compressed formats that result in smaller file sizes that are more suitable for sharing. JPEGs are great because they can be opened in a variety of programs and are good for sharing images online. And PDFs are great because you can combine multiple pages very easily, and this is a widely adopted format, can open in a lot of different programs as well. And we'll get to determining color in just a couple of slides, so I'll address your question there, Amanda. Okay, resolution determines the amount of fine detail that you capture. Not all types of material have the same resolution requirements. So for example, while most documents can be scanned at 300 or 400 ppi, a 35mm slide should be scanned at a much higher resolution in order to capture all of the information contained in it. So here are a few examples of FADGI's resolution recommendations for different types of material at the 3 and 4 star level. And then I see one question here, PPI and DPI are the same, they're interchangeable. PPI is pixels per inch and DPI is dots per inch. And then PNG and JPEG, I think you can use either of those. PNG is more often used for web publication. Bit depth, as I mentioned before, is the depth of color information you're getting per pixel. Generally for fine art, photographs, and prints, should have a higher bit depth and capture a greater level of color information. And other materials such as documents, newspapers, and microfilm might not need that level of information to be recorded, since the value in these types of documents is often the text itself. So for color space, FADGI has a few that they recommend throughout their guidelines, but very simplistically, gray gamma is for black and white. sRGB has a small range of colors and is suitable for things such as newspapers and general collection documents. Adobe RGB 1998 has a wider range of colors, and it's almost universally accepted by many different softwares and displays. And ProPhoto RGB has an even larger range of colors and provides a lot of flexibility in editing. This is a newer color space. The one we usually use and recommend at CCAHA is Adobe RGB 1998, mostly because of its wide adoption. And last listed in the FADGI performance level table is color and black and white. And again, simply, this is just determining whether you want to scan your materials in color or black and white. And this can have a huge impact on your file size. So black and white files are about 1/3 the size of color files. So this will have a big impact on the file storage needs. So lots of materials such as newspapers, printed books, and black and white photographs and negatives can generally be scanned in black and white unless there is important color or tonal information that you need to capture. Cropping and file naming are not included in the performance level tables in the FADGI document, but recommendations are included in the guidelines. It's generally good practice to show all edges of the page or object and crop so that there's a small border on all sides. On derivative files, you can crop to the edge and adjust color and contrast as needed. So this is an example of a negative that we recently scanned for St. Olaf College. And you can see in the master file, we show the edges of the negative, but in the cropped version, it's a little cleaner and maybe more suitable for web publication or for use in design or marketing. File naming, there's no real strict specifications for file naming. Each institution will adopt a structure that works best for them and their collections. So some rules of thumb are that file names should be unique and consistently structured. Simple file naming structure is good, especially for large projects, but you do want to include some level of description. So consider including your institution abbreviation or identifying the collection or sub-collection name. So in the example given here, the first file name is St. Olaf _RML _Felland _0001. And this shows that the file belongs to the St. Olaf College Rolvag Memorial Library. It's part of the Felland collection and it's negative number 1 in the series, versus just 0001, which only tells you that the image number is first in a series. In this example, you can see that I've used leading zeros, which will help to enable numerical sorting. And when you're choosing a file naming schema, you want to be wary of using shelf numbers or locations to identify files, because these can change and then cause confusion later on. The American Library Association includes a simple and useful guide for creating file naming schemas as an appendix to their digitization guidelines. So I've included a link again to that here. And there it is in the chat. Great. So we've talked about how to go about making decisions for file specifications for file type, resolution, bit depth, color space, color, cropping, and file naming. I've been focusing here on the FADGI guidelines, but it's important to reiterate that these are just guidelines. I encourage you all to look to FADGI as a starting point, but also look at the ALA and NARA guidelines and consider consulting with other colleagues who may have undertaken similar projects. Now, whatever you decide, it's critically important to write it down. And I think I've said this at the end of each of these sessions so far, and I will continue to advocate for this. It's especially important for these decisions related to file specifications so that you're digitizing consistently over the life of the project and beyond. The guidelines you create can also be referred to by the people that are picking up the project later on. Here are a few examples of some local digitization guidelines developed by institutions. I've included links for Digital North Carolina and Columbia University Libraries. And we focus today on still images. But I know many of you will have audio and motion picture materials in your collections as well. So I'm including a link here to the FADGI Audiovisual Working Group resources. I know that this presentation was more technical than the first two, and I have seen the questions coming in that I'll address in just a minute. I hope that it's been useful in explaining how various file specifications affect your digitization project. And again, all of these will be recorded, and so please join me again at the same time next week for a discussion on metadata. Then we'll take a look at the pros and cons of setting up your digitization project in-house versus outsourcing it to a vendor, and how to maintain quality control. And then we'll wrap it up for now with a session on equipment selection on July 28th. So here's my email address for some questions. I'll get to some of these that I can, but in the interest of time, we may cut it off a little short, and then I'll follow up with folks via email. So I see one question. Sorry, the chat box is a little bit small, so I'm having trouble reading these. Okay. JPEG 2000, can you talk about JPEG 2000 as a master file format? Yes, so this is a file format that is listed in the FADGI guidelines. However, with talking with colleagues, it's not, I found that it's not that widely adopted, and some image viewers have issues opening it. So I don't generally myself recommend it as a preservation format, only because of its adoption. But it is supposed to be a very stable format. I have a question. My institution has Epson scanners that use only sRGB but offer a bit depth up to 24-bit color. So is it better to use 24-bit color instead of 16-bit? And is it better to use a higher bit rate, especially if the color profile is limited? Well, that's a good question. I don't know how to respond to that on the technical level now, but I could get back to you, Patrick, and we can correspond via email. Looking here. Do you have advice for scanning negatives and converting to positive images? We have a box of negatives and no idea what to do with them. I generally recommend scanning and keeping the negative file, and then just inverting it using an image editing program like Photoshop. I have one question here from a couple minutes back. Can you discuss dice targets? And those are the targets. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the equipment selection, but these are targets that are used and recommended in the FADGI recommendations for calibrating your equipment. So we'll get into that a little bit more at the end of this session or series. Okay, so yeah, the Patrick's question on scanning in 16-bit versus 24-bit color. I'll try to send out a link to that with all of these resources that will go out with the link to the recording. Okay, and please feel free to email me if I didn't answer your question. I saw a lot of them came in, but we are trying to keep these webinars brief for everybody. So thank you all for tuning in. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next week.